Last week, we began to discuss the area of Chinuch Yeladim, educating, raising one's children. That is also part of the essentials of interpersonal relationships. We spoke about the relationship between man and woman, husband and wife, and now we're entering a more complicated area in a sense, the relationship between parents and their kids, and vice versa, the relationship between the kids and their parents, which B'ezrat Hashem will cover after Tisha B'Av. And last week I discussed a little bit about the various influences. The parents are not the only ones influencing, contributing to the molding of the personality. You have outside influences. We spoke about the special bond, the kesher between the parents and the children. The Torah's tzivui, the Torah's commandment of Vishinantam Levanecha, the importance of the chinuch is not only to transmit knowledge, but to transmit the tradition intact over so many generations. So there is an emphasis in the Torah about forming a very strong relationship with one's children, not only to bond, but actually to inspire them to be able to transmit that tradition. And I gave a few examples of active, passive, and reactionary type of education. There are some times where we act, we say, and sometimes that even though we're passive, we're still communicating to them a certain message of what we expect of them. Another way of calling dugma ishit, an example. Dugma ishit is a passive form of chinuch. And we spoke briefly about the importance of the timing. The younger, the better. What I want to do today is give you some real examples of how important it is that the parents invest in the education of their children, because depending on what standards they make for themselves in their home, those will be the standards that the child will most likely have in his home. The relationship that the husband and wife have to each other will therefore affect the relationship that their children will have with their spouses. How the children see their parents behaving towards each other with respect or disrespect will greatly affect, it will have a tremendous impact on the children. So what we're dealing with here is not only the influence of the parent over the child's personality as an individual, as a human being, but also as a future parent, as a future husband. That is why all of this is so important. The parent's attitude, I want to spend a few moments about the parent's attitude towards certain subjects, is also very important. If a father or mother belittles somebody or something, the child will pick up on that. Let me give you an example of something that a parent may have a big emphasis on, may put a big emphasis on, he may value very much, and the child will follow. And that is luxuries, money, excesses. If a parent puts a tremendous emphasis on these things, if he values it greatly, then all the child will do is talk about money. If money was important to the father or mother, it will be important to the child. So much so that if this was overemphasized, if this was the subject of discussion, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, then when the child begins to look for a soulmate, for a shidduch, he will look for a girl, or the girl will look for a boy who has money. Since that's what the parents spoke about, that's what they will value, that's what will be important to them. What will happen to good manners, to modesty, to yirat shamayim, that will be in the back seat. I have already heard some people say they want somebody with money. And if she's good looking and she has good manners, that's also good. That should be first, especially the good manners. No, it's also good. Gam tov, alevai. But first they mention money. Where does that come from? These are values that they picked up at home probably. It's not written anywhere. Who teaches that? So depending on what the parents emphasize, depending on what they value, that is what they will communicate to their children, what's important to them. And that's what most likely will be important to the children. If the parents value Torah, if they value Talmidei Chachamim, then obviously this will have some influence on the children as well. One of the most painful, influences is when a parent at the Shabbat table, let's use the Shabbat table as an example, openly discusses an individual who he dislikes and speaks lashon hara about them and brings about machloket, divisiveness, rechilut, and everything else that goes along with it, sinat chinam, which is very appropriate for us to discuss during this time right before Tisha B'Av. So what is happening at the Shabbat table? Instead of having zemirot, instead of having divrei Torah, instead of having a peaceful table, not only are they having so many arguments, not only are there shouting matches, but the content on the table, on the Shabbat table of all days, the Kedusha of Shabbat, is being desecrated with lashon hara and machloket. And I don't really mean machloket in the sense that you perhaps understand it. Terrible fights and terrible divisiveness. Machloket could mean that one is not respectful of another Jew. There are some Jews that don't like certain sects in Judaism, and they belittle them, they ridicule them, they make fun of them. And we know that all Jews are equal, they're all important, but to some individuals on the Shabbat table in front of their children, they're willing to look down at some Jews, to say bad things about them. Let's not talk about whether it's true or false, that's another issue. But even if it were to be true, be careful what you're saying, because how are we ever going to stop machloket and lashon hara and sinat chinam in Am Yisrael if it doesn't stop at one's table? This is where it begins, and this is where it will stop. It all begins at one's table. People don't get together on the street and decide, to make machloket. If the father's and mother's attitude is of machloket, of lashon hara, the children will learn, the neighbors will catch on, and the fire will spread. So the same way it begins at one's table, it needs to stop at the table. If parents don't want their kids to continue on with this attitude of divisiveness, of looking down at certain Jews, of having sinat chinam, they have to be an example. And if a child comes back from school and he picked up something in school from another child, the parent should put a stop to it. No lashon hara is accepted. Every Jew is special in some way. Even though we don't agree perhaps with certain things, it doesn't mean we should look down at them. It doesn't mean we should speak bad about them. So the parents have a tremendous responsibility in this area called lashon hara and sinat chinam, baseless hatred. Since we're approaching Tisha B'Av, and the second temple unfortunately was destroyed because of baseless hatred, I'll briefly go over one incident, actually the most important incident that's related to the Gemara that brought about the destruction. That's the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, which you may have heard. There were two individuals. One was named Kamsa, the other one was Bar Kamsa. And there was a third individual who wanted to throw a big party, and he invited many guests, and he wanted to invite his friend Kamsa too. But the messenger who this man sent to invite made a mistake. And instead of inviting Kamsa the friend, he invited Bar Kamsa the enemy. So at the big party, none other than Bar Kamsa arrives. And the individual who invited the guest was very upset. He went over to Mr. Bar Kamsa and says, "What are you doing here? We're enemies. I don't want to see your face." The man, of course, was embarrassed. He thought all along that perhaps this man was trying to make peace. And that is why he invited him. After all, according to some commentaries, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa were father and son. Kamsa was the father and Bar Kamsa was the son. So maybe because of my father's honor, he wanted to make peace with me, he wants to be in good terms. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone himself. What is he doing there? So the man tells him, "Listen, I don't want to see you here. Get out." He says, "Listen, since I'm already here, let me stay. I'm willing to pay for my meal." He says, "No way, get out. I'm willing to pay for half the cost of all the meals." "No way. I'm willing to pay for the entire dinner, for the entire banquet. Just spare me the shame." He says, "No way, get out of here quickly." And he actually took him out. As the Bar Kamsa is stepping out, he looks back and he sees all the Talmidei Chachamim who were sitting on the head table, and he says, since they did not intercede on my behalf and do something about it, apparently they agreed, they accepted. If one does not say something about something, what he's communicating is that he agrees with it. Since the Chachamim agreed with it, I'm going to go tell the authorities about this, not about this incident, but that the Jews rebelled against the Romans. And that is how the Churban Abayit began to take shape. Another Jew telling on his brothers that they committed a crime, that they rebelled against the king, and which was untrue, unfounded. But he, of course, chose something to get back at them because of the way he was treated. He did a terrible thing, of course, but so did they, for allowing this to happen. But the Gemara says as follows: the Churban Abayit came about as a result of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. So one of the commentaries asks, why is Kamsa blamed all of a sudden? Kamsa was the good man. He was the friend. The rabbi should have said the Churban came about as a result of Bar Kamsa, and a man named Bar Kamsa. Why did the Gemara choose to say that what led to the destruction of the temple was an incident that had to do with Kamsa and Bar Kamsa? The commentaries explain, because if Bar Kamsa was able to act the way he did, in such a treacherous way, in such betraying his own people, where did he pick it up from? He must have seen his father behaving the same way. So because of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the Churban occurred. The father also had something to do with it. The son would not have acted the way he did against his own brothers and sisters unless he saw it at home, unless his father was an individual who also looked down at rabbis, who also was disrespectful towards his religion. So that is why his name is mentioned. Another example of how kids pick up something at home is another story in the Gemara, Masechet Sukkah, of Miriam bat Bilga. This is a woman who, when she grew up, Hemira et data, she left her religion. She assimilated to the Greeks. This is during the time when the Greeks ruled, close to the time of the story of Hanukkah. And when the Greeks took over and when they controlled the Bet HaMikdash, she went into the area where the Mizbeach was and kicked it and said, Lokos, Lokos, Ad mata eta mechaleh me'amonam shel Yisrael? Until when will you rob the Jews of their money? Lokos is a Greek word for wolf. That's the way she was calling the Mizbeach, who was eating away. The sacrifices cost money. So she was complaining to the Mizbeach, until when are you robbing the Jews of their money by taking all these sacrifices? In other words, she was disrespectful. As soon as the rabbis heard of this incident, that a Jewish girl should say what she said and behave like that, she belonged to a family of Kohanim. And the Kohanim, as you probably know, took turns of doing certain jobs at the Bet HaMikdash. Her family, the Bilga Mishmeret, was left out. In other words, they penalized that family, that Mishmeret, because of this girl's action. They penalized the entire Mishmeret, the entire group, all the family members. And the Gemara asks, why is everybody to blame for this? It's only one girl, one individual. And the Gemara says, Shuta de Yankuta, or Shuta de Yenuka Beshuka, o me'abua, o me'ime. A conversation of a child in the street, in the marketplace, that conversation comes either from the father or from the mother. If you hear the child say certain things, where does that come from? Where did he pick it up? It's either from the father or the mother. So if Miriam bat Bilga was able to do what she did and behave so disrespectfully towards the Bet HaMikdash, towards the Mizbeach, where did she pick it up if not at home? If she's like that, then her entire family is like that, and everybody is to blame. So everybody is penalized. Another example. There were a few kids, Kohanim, who sat down to talk about their share of the lechem apanim. The lechem apanim was a bread that the Kohanim would eventually eat, and they would divide it up amongst themselves, but there was not enough for everybody, so everybody got small little pieces. So one time a few children got together and spoke about how large of a share each one got. One said his share was as large as a bean. Another one said that his share was as large as, I already forget, something else. And the third child said that his share was as large as the tail of a lizard. When the rabbis found out that this child, described the lechem apanim, his share, kezanav haleta'a, like the tail of a lizard, something so tameh, impure, they checked his family. They looked into his family, they investigated, and they found shemetz shel pasul. They found that there was something to disqualify them from the kehuna. It could not have been that this child would describe something so holy like the lechem apanim, like the tail of a lizard, unless he heard something like that in his family, unless his family was disrespectful, spoke that kind of foul language, and they investigated it, and they found, yes, of course, that family was not pure. There was something wrong, some pesul in the family. In Parashat Emor, you will find an incident where a bat kohen is put to death if she committed a grave sin, and the Torah says she's put to a unique death, b'srefa, through hot lead. Why? Et avia hi mechalelet. She's profaning her father. In other words, she comes from kehuna. So because of that, because she comes from kehuna, she is unique. Her punishment is unique. It's very serious what she committed. I saw one commentary say, what the Torah is really telling us with the words et avia hi mechalelet, she's actually accusing her father. Her sin, her maaseh, is blaming the father. Et avia hi mechalelet. By her acting the way she did, she's really pointing a finger to her father. In other words, how did she come to this if not for the father? So we see from all of this, and there are many more examples, that the children pick up a lot at home. Because of the importance of the early years, when a child absorbs a lot, the Torah has a special mitzvah once every 7 years. After the Shemitah, after the 7th year, and beginning of the 8th year, in Chag HaSukkot, there's a mitzvah called Hakhel. Everybody would come. Not only the men would come to Yerushalayim, the men, the women, and the children would come. Everybody would come to hear the king read from the Torah. And the rabbis discuss, why do the children have to come? The men need to learn Torah, the women need to hear the Torah. But what about the children? And the Gemara says that they are brought so that the parents receive reward for bringing them. But what is the real message behind bringing the children? Because even though they're small, they may be 1-year-old, they may be 2-year-old, they still absorb. And even a little baby absorbs. And there are many tests, scientific tests, to prove that children can actually remember something or retain something even from when they were very, very young. It is impressed on them in their brain, and it remains there. And through hypnosis, sometimes you can actually bring it out. From very early on, it's made its mark. That is why the rabbis tell us in Pirkei Avot, Halomed yeled lema'u domeh, one who teaches a child, what is he compared to? To applying dio al niyar chadash, to applying ink on a clean piece of paper. One who teaches an older man, what is he compared to? To applying the ink on paper that has been erased several times. What is the idea over here of ink being applied to new, fresh paper? There's several ideas. Number one, when it's ink on a brand new piece of paper, then it has a better chance of remaining there. It will not be easily erased. This is the first time the ink is being absorbed into the paper. If the paper has had ink, it has been erased several times, and you want to write again, it doesn't stay, it doesn't stick as well. An older person, like they say in English, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Is that what it is? Yeah. An older man who's been brainwashed with communism for 65 years, to clean all that out first, it's difficult. He has formed certain habits. He has certain beliefs. It's still possible, but it's hard. A child is fresh. This is fresh paper. You're applying the ink. It's going to stay there. That's number one. Number two, that ink is in first position. Anybody here who's familiar with real estate knows that lenders always want to be in first place, in first position. Just in case the loan is defaulted on and that house is foreclosed on, they want to make sure that they can collect. So they want to be in first place, because if there's not enough money to cover all the loans, all the debts, they want to make sure they get as much as they can. Right? You understand what I mean? To be in first position. Well, this child, we spoke about last week, is going to be influenced by his parents, by his teachers, by his friends, by many outside influences in the future. We want to make sure that the first position is the parents, and that position is strong. As I've always said, if the root system is very strong at home, then even later on, even though Chaz v'Shalom something happens and he weakens and he slacks off, if he's had a solid foundation, he can always come back to it, because what was there in first position was the parents' education. He can always fall back on it. And we have heard many stories of good children who have unfortunately gone off the derech, but they've come back because they've had a solid foundation. What was there in the first place? What was there in the first place was very good. It was solid. So even though they've spent many years doing all sorts of things that are unacceptable, they were wild, they were misbehaved, they got into trouble, they landed in jail, but you know what? They have a solid foundation. It will be easier to bring them back, because who was there in first place matters. Rabbis also have an expression called girsata de yankuta. What you learned when you were very young, when you were a tinok, stays forever. Whatever you learned when you were 10 years old, 11 years old, 12 years old, you don't easily forget. What you learn when you're 40 or 50, you forget quickly. And that is what Shlomo Melech tells us. Chanoch lanar al pi darko, gam ki yaskin lo yasur mimeno. Early on, if you train a child, if you educate him, whatever you give him when he was young, gam ki yaskin, even when he will be older, he will not forget it. There's another important pasuk that says, Hosech shifto sone beno, ve'ohavo shicharo musar. This is a very important pasuk, because there's two important messages here. Hosech shifto sone beno, whoever holds back the whip ends up hating his child. That's number one, and I'll explain that a little bit later. Ve'ohavo shicharo musar. Whoever loves his child gives him musar b'shahar. What's shahar? Early on in the morning. If you really love your child, then you rebuke him, you reprimand him, you don't hold back the whip. Hosech shifto, if any parent holds it back when there is a need for it, and sometimes there is a need, then he ends up hating the child. When that child grows up, he will be uncontrollable, unmanageable. It will be too difficult for the parent to correct his mischievous acts at that point. He's already a grown man. So Shlomo Melech is telling us in Mishlei that there is an importance of giving early on, shahar, from the early years, musar, rebuke. How? Sometimes with a shevet, with a whip. Now, I don't literally mean that you have to whip him. No, I'll explain what that means. Shevet means, the idea behind the shevet is to reprimand, to be strict, and to not let something go. But I will explain a little bit later what that means. Whereas by Adoniyahu, David HaMelech's son, what does the pasuk say? V'lo atzavo aviv miyamav lemor madua ata oseh, madua asita kach. Since David HaMelech never reprimanded him, never told him off, never said anything when something was wrong, Adoniyahu rebelled against his own father. So even David HaMelech, who was a great man, because he, of course, we give him the benefit of the doubt, he was so busy, and he overlooked a little bit one of his children, and as a result of that, the child did not come out what you expect him to be, the son of David HaMelech. The Ralbag has an interesting interpretation of the pasuk, Chanoch lanar al pi darko. Chanoch lanar al pi darko literally means educate your child according to his capacity. And if you do so commensurately, then gam ki yaskin lo yasur mimeno, it will always remain with him. Don't overpressure him. Don't give him too much. Give him whatever he can handle. But the Rabbi says it a little bit differently. Hanoch lanar al pi darko. If you educate a child according to his nature, in other words, you say, let him be whatever he is. Things will work out. He will mature. Then gam ki yaskin lo yasur mimeno. When he grows older, whatever he got used to will not leave him. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to just let a child grow on his own, develop the way he wants to. Because when he becomes older, it will be very difficult for him to drop his old habits. Even though we spoke about the importance of early education, I want to emphasize another very important point, and that is that there is a difference between the various stages. The dividing line is before bar mitzvah and after bar mitzvah. Anybody know what happens after bar mitzvah? No patches? Okay.
He gets a yetzer hora.
No, he gets a yetzer tov after bar mitzvah, right. Obviously there's quite a bit of a difference. What? Yeah. There's a big difference between before bar mitzvah and after bar mitzvah. The simple difference is as follows. The pasuk in Mishlei says, Ivelet keshura belev nar, shevet musar yarchikenu mimena. Ivelet keshura, Ivelet is mischief. A child is mischievous when he's young, before bar mitzvah. He has no yetzer tov. He wants everything for himself. He doesn't want to share. He's rebellious. He's disobedient. Doesn't listen because there's no yetzer tov. He only thinks of himself. What's convenient, what's good for him. So shevet musar, so you sometimes need a whip, you sometimes need a spank. I'm not going to use the word patch for a good reason. You know why? When you hear the word patch in Yiddish, it usually means on the face. And that usually you don't want to do. Whereas if you use the word spank in English, a spank is not on the face. It's somewhere else in the body. Right? Everybody know? Everybody understands? Yeah. And I'll tell you why in a moment. So, in order to remove that mischief, you sometimes need a spank. Because there's no yetzer tov. After a child becomes bar mitzvah, the rabbis tell us one has to be much more careful with how he reprimands his child. Why? Because of the pasuk lifnei iver lo titen michshol. Before a blind man, you cannot put an obstacle. What does that have to do with one's child over bar mitzvah? A child after bar mitzvah can hit his father back, chas v'shalom. And you don't want to bring him to that, provoke him. So you are putting an obstacle before the blind if you are provoking that. So you have to be careful so that he should not transgress a terrible sin of chas v'shalom, hitting back or being disrespectful to his father. So you have to be much more careful after bar mitzvah on how to deal with a child. It doesn't mean you don't reprimand him, you don't tell him off. Of course you do. That goes on for all your life. As long as you have any contact with your child, you continue to reprimand, to say, and to correct him. But there's of course a difference on how to do it and how to go about it. But let's go back to before bar mitzvah. Before bar mitzvah, there's really a greater need for reprimand. Why? Because the experts tell us that a child himself wants it. A child is undisciplined and he craves for some order in his life. So he's really begging for discipline. He won't tell it to you in those words, but psychologically, mentally, that is what a child really needs. He needs to be organized, he needs discipline. So it's important that the parent apply it. Nevertheless, the rabbis tell us if you apply discipline, then a few minutes later apply love. If you applied your left hand in pushing off the child and saying no, or in reprimanding him, make sure that you also apply your right hand in hugging him, kissing him, and reassuring him that you love him. Because more than anything else, a child wants to always be reassured that his parent loves him. That's very, very important to him. And he won't tell you that, but deep down that's what he wants. So what happens when there's too much reprimand and too much rebuke? What will happen? What will suffer? The chinuch may not suffer necessarily, but what will suffer will be the bond between the father and the son. A son wants his father to be his friend too. I've heard it from many people, that is something that a child always wants, that his father should be his friend. If his father can play with him, if his father can go on a trip with him, if his father can spend time with him. Not all parents can do that. But in reality, the reason why this is good is because if one it can be his friend, one can be more effective in telling him, I really mean your benefit, I really mean this for your own good, as opposed to a father having the role of a policeman. And what did we say last week? Jewish education is not iluf, it's chinuch. Iluf means to train, chinuch means to educate. Who do we train? We train an animal, we train an elephant, we train a tiger in a circus, right? We're not interested in training, because in order to succeed in training, all you need is a policeman. Policeman to demand that this be done. We're not interested in that kind of a relationship. We're interested in chinuch. We want the child to acquire certain values. We want the child to want to do it on his own 20 years from now, not by force. If the child will do it on his own, then we know we succeeded. So that's the difference between chinuch and iluf. Yes? Yeah, I'm getting to that. Yeah. No, what does it mean? She asked, what does it mean to give a patch and a few moments later to show love? Rabbis tell us, small docha v'mi mekarevet. Use your left to rebuke. The left hand is the weaker hand, and use your right to bring close. I've heard from some experts that say as follows: when you hit a child, use your hand. Don't use an object. Why? Because if you use your hand, you will be in pain. It will hurt you. And if it hurts you, you know not to give more, because it hurts the child. If you're using an object, you won't know how much it hurts. So use your hand, and use the back of your hand if possible. But anyway, it all depends on the circumstances. In schools, I know in certain schools many years ago, today they'll sue you if you do that, but many years ago, the teachers would do other things. They would use, I think, a shoelace, something that would hurt. Yes?
Why do you feel this generation is more disrespectful to the parents, is more chutzpah than previous generations?
That's another topic. The disrespect between children and parents is the opposite relationship. Right now we're speaking about the relationship of parents towards the children, and what you're asking is about the relationship of children towards their parents. That will be the subject after Tisha B'Av. Okay? But right now we're concentrating on the bond between that the parents have to form with their child. What is their obligation, and what they need to do. This is obviously not a simple matter, because we sometimes want to reprimand. We don't know how much. We don't know how much to hit, when to hit. It's not easy. One has to be careful not to overdo it. The rabbis tell us, even though this is correct and it's sometimes necessary, be careful not to overdo it, because when you overdo it, you lose your child. You want to strengthen the bond too. You don't want to just give information, give chinuch. You also want to form a bond. You want him to continue to love you, to respect you. So you have to walk a very, very fine line here of applying both the left hand and the right hand. So in answer to your question, the left hand is when you refuse, when you reprimand, and it could be 5, 10, 15 minutes later, or even a couple hours later. You go over to your child, you know what, I still love you, I care for you very much, but what you did was not right. Terrible. And I expect you to behave next time. I expect you to be a good boy or a good girl, whoever it is that you're talking to. And each parent in their own style should communicate their feelings openly to the child, but in a way that the child feels reassured that the parent is not just a policeman, but the parent is also a friend. So it does not have to happen a minute or two later, otherwise it appears to be contradictory. A minute later, you're already hugging the child. You want to allow some time to pass. The same is true with the first initial reprimand itself. If the father comes home after a long day and he hears from his wife that your son just did this, he shouldn't immediately approach him, because after a long day he may be tired, he may be upset, he may have fought with his boss, and now he's going to lay it out all on his child. Let him wait an hour or two, let him eat dinner first, let him calm down, and then let him go into his child's bedroom and have a talk with him. If you immediately act after hearing what your wife told you, you may lose control. So So that's just another idea. Yes?
I just like to ask you, let's say it's the same mother, the same father in a family,
Right.
and one child comes out wonderful,
Right.
and the other child is no nada. So
Right.
how
I'm-
do you explain
I'm going to
that?
speak about that soon. Right, that's another point we're going to cover tonight. Yeah, that's a good question. How come not all the children are alike? Right. Rabbis tell us, "Leolam al yatil eima yetera- leolam al yatil adam eima yetera beveto." One should be very careful not to threaten, to use threats too much in one's home. And what the rabbis are telling us is this is not only on children, but even against one's wife. Don't threaten too much, because when a man threatens, when a father threatens, a husband threatens, the consequences can be terrible. Many tragedies have occurred just because of a threat. No action was taken. A father threatened his child so much that the child went and hanged himself. Yeah, the child, because the father said, "If you do this, this is what's going to happen to you." And the child wanted, of course, to avoid that, being too young to understand that there's other ways around this problem. He just went and hanged himself. So you have to be very careful. Many women who were threatened by their husbands have also made terrible mistakes. Imagine, to give you a quick example that is mentioned in the Gemara, a woman who's afraid to tell her husband that she couldn't go to the mikveh for some reason. She didn't make it. But she knows that her husband is going to have a fit. And she lies. And she says she went. Terrible avon, a terrible sin, but this has happened. If we have time, I'll tell you a few stories about that. But one has to be very careful not to overdo it, not to be overly strict, not to threaten. Ultimately, what we're interested here as parents is to develop a strong bond with our children, and we don't want that bond to weaken. So we have to walk that very fine line of not overdoing it. The reason why love is so important is not only because we want to maintain a strong bond with a child for many years, but for another reason. You may remember in Pirkei Avot, Aharon was known for what? Ohev et habriot umekarvan laTorah, right? Aaron used to love Jews, love people, and he used to bring them close to Torah. So I once explained that the reason why Aaron was so effective in bringing Jews close to the Torah is because he loved them. Uahav et habriot, and because of that, uaya mekarev otam laTorah. Because when somebody senses that you love him, that you care for him, it's easier for you to be effective, to get through to him. Your words will make such a difference, much more than a rabbi. A rabbi can give 1,000 speeches and it won't make a difference. But a good friend who really cares for you, who honestly and sincerely tells you that you are wrong and corrects you, that might be much more effective because it's coming from a friend, from somebody who cares about you. And you have no doubts that he cares about you. So that is something that parents or friends can capitalize on. If if you like someone and that individual knows you like them, then you have a greater obligation to reprimand them, to correct them. And parents, more than anybody else, hopefully they love their children, just that the children don't always understand it and see it that way. So for a parent to be effective, he has to convince his child, one way or another, that he really cares for them. Whoever loves people, whoever cares for them, has a greater chance to bring them close to Torah, to influencing them. Since we want to prove to the child, we want to demonstrate to the child that we care about him, one has to be very careful about another thing. The Rabbi tells, L'olam al yishaneh adam et beno ben abanim. One should be careful not to play favorites and show more favoritism to one child more to another. Who made that mistake? Yaakov. Exactly. Even though, of course, Yaakov didn't mean it in any way, but he was very close. He learned Torah with Yosef. They had a special relationship, and nevertheless, that is how it appeared, at least. We would never accuse Yaakov of doing it intentionally, but that's the appearance it gave, and many problems resulted as a result of that. So one has to be careful. If you want a strong relationship, You want to have it with all your kids and not show one more than another. Because I've seen situations where after the parents have passed away, how the kids fought. The children have fought and they blame the parent. You were always the favorite. You always got everything. Here you thought that these are grown-ups, but they're acting and behaving like children. But that is unfortunately the impression they got. It's a wrong impression, a terrible impression. One has to be careful to show love to all his children. So since we're talking about love, one has to be careful with not overdoing that either. Spoiling a child is also no good. And the damage that is caused by spoiling a child is almost irreversible. Many kids who've gotten everything they ever wanted, at the end, they go crazy. They go insane. They feel an emptiness in their life. Not only that, they're not necessarily more respectful and more loving of their parents because they got everything. On the contrary, they become very difficult to deal with because they got everything they ever demanded. So one has to be very careful with that too. A child is a child and you don't give in. I remember when I have had my first child, in the beginning some children wake up a whole night to nurse. Some babies sleep better. And sometimes it's hard to know if they're really hungry or they just want attention. After a while you get used to it, you learn. And they told us that if it's pure attention, just let them cry. Of course, as long as it's not hysterical, because you always have to check. You can't just take a chance. But sometimes it's just better to let them cry a little bit, and at the second and third night they'll stop. So when it comes to kids that are demanding, don't spoil them, just, don't give in. I know of a story where a woman went with her child to some store, I think it was a toy store in Israel. And the child wanted something which was very expensive, beyond what the mother can afford. But he had a fit of anger, and he lay down on the floor and he would not move. And the mother had to go over to the child and said, "You know what, please don't embarrass me, I'll buy you what you want." Incredible. She did not want to be embarrassed, and because of that she was willing to go into debt, to borrow money, to buy this child just this big truck that cost so much money that she couldn't afford. That's terrible. That's really not a good thing to do. Not a good example. All right, now we've gotten to the point where we have to try to figure out the difference between children. Yes? Yeah. I'm getting to that too. Right. Okay, not all children are alike. And the reason for that, yes?
Well, you were saying about like the babies who want attention, they're not
Yes.
knowing not to think about.
Right.
Actually, I've read a few books. Lately they're saying no. If you can't give them attention, it's good because they say that's one thing you don't give them attention. That's one way it's okay to spoil them, to give them love. When
Right.
they're little, that's the only thing that's okay to.
Yeah, the experts are always changing their mind. You're right. And I only use that as an example, but it may not necessarily be so. You have to use your best judgment. Sometimes really they just have stomach aches. It could be something minor, and it's hard to know what it is. I think they call it colic, right? And it's hard to really figure it out. With most babies, they're so cute, how could you not pick them up, right? How could you just let them cry? But depending on their age, if they're 4, 5, 6 months old, not 1 month, 2 months, obviously there's some leeway. All right, not all children are alike, and the reason for that is because they have two parents, and one child sometimes has more genes from one parent than he has from the other. Just look at Yaakov and Esav. How could Yitzchak and Rivka have an Esav? Yaakov, of course, but Esav. But people forget that who was Rivka's brother? Lavan. Right? Rabbis tell us whenever you marry a woman, check out her brothers. Sure, because many of the traits and the genes are transmitted to your children. But that's only one explanation. Obviously, kids are different because they have a different disposition as a result of the mazal that they're born in. We spoke a little bit about astrology several weeks ago. Every child has a different disposition, different mentality, different way of looking at things, different priorities, different likes and dislikes, a different yetzer hara, a completely different strengths and weaknesses, just because of who he is. Besides the fact that he inherited certain traits from his parents. Besides the influences of the surroundings. And some kids are more susceptible than others. Some just absorb everything, and it's dangerous for them to be around the wrong people. Some kids can take pressure a lot better, and they resist it. So kids are different because of various factors, depending on who their friends are, and so forth. And therefore, since kids are different, the chinuch is not always the same for two children. Certain rules will always be the same, but certain behavior problems will require special care, depending on what the problem is. Certain things will be the same, but certain things will need to be different. That is why I'll mention the pasuk I mentioned before. Shlomo Melech tells us, "Chanoch lanar al pi darko." You have to educate a child according to his capacity. You can't expect him to be an Albert Einstein and a genius and memorize everything. Not every child is capable of doing that. But if a child is capable, then of course, give him more. If he's talented, let him take some lessons in violin, piano, and drums. If he can handle that, give it to him. That's what the rabbis tell us. Every child according to his capacity. Not to overdo it, not to underdo it. And of course, this is not something that we can figure out on our own. Sometimes we need help, from others to help us, figure out what this child is capable of doing. Because sometimes we see that a child is not doing well in school. Is it really because he's not paying attention? Or is it because he has a certain weakness? So what do? You go to an expert. And the expert is able to diagnose what this is. All it could be is a lack of, what do they call it, deficit attention? He can't focus well. He can't focus well. It's not that he doesn't want to learn. It's not that he's lazy. But parents sometimes immediately blame the child. Why are you not learning? Why aren't you paying attention? So sometimes we don't recognize what the problem is, and it may require special care, and we need to consult with an expert. Yeah.
You have to also mention maybe to that lady's question.
Right.
What you said a few weeks ago about the neshama that comes down when the parents are together.
Right. I mentioned last week that, of course, the neshama, depending on what neshama is in that physical body, that makes a difference too. Yes, you're right. All of that makes a difference. So the two children from the same parents can have two very different neshamot, and that also makes a difference. There's another pasuk that says as follows: Gam b'ma'alalav yitnaker nar. When a child is young, from his activities you can already tell imzach v'yashar pa'olo, if he will be a good boy or not, depending on what he does. When he's 5-6 years old, you can already tell a lot. In other words, what to expect from this child when he will grow up. And therefore, if you notice something not right, you deal with it immediately and not let it develop and get out of hand later on. Okay, so we spoke a little bit about the various, not techniques, but the various ideas of how education comes about, the various influences, the home, the surroundings, the school, and the importance of it being early on, because whatever a child absorbs earlier on, this is what will remain with him. However, there are some points that are common to all children that need to be greatly emphasized. Even though I said it last week, I want to repeat it again. And that is, number one, the dugma ishit, the example the parents set at home. That is probably the most powerful influence of them all. A child sees his parents behaving in a certain way, speaking in a certain way, then most likely this will influence him more than anything else. That is number one. Number two, what I'd like to add is who the parents admire. If the parents admire Talmidei Chachamim and Tzaddikim, and they say, this is what we admire, this is who we look up to, then hopefully the children will look up to them too. If a child puts up a big picture of a basketball player in his room, and this is who he admires, it's a little bit of a problem. If he wants to collect cards, that's okay. All children collect a card. I used to collect soccer cards because where I come from, there was no baseball, only soccer. So soccer was important, but even that stops after a certain age, except when it comes to the championship. Then we all get excited again, right? But we don't collect cards anymore. But to put a big poster, a big picture of this is his idol, it's not right. Let him put pictures of tzaddikim. So depending on what his father hangs up, right? So if the parents admire tzaddikim talmidei chachamim, hopefully the child will see that and he will admire them at some point. Yes.
How about if the parents put a picture of a rabbi's child and the child will just put a picture of one of the people he said, then how do we react?
It's not forbidden. Obviously, those pictures are not forbidden, and you at least want to make a point of it. You want to have a picture, keep it small, right? Why cover your whole wall with somebody that the Judaism doesn't have any admiration for? Why? What for? And obviously, if he insists on it, you don't have to make a big issue from it at the start. But don't let it come to that point. The pasuk says, I think in the Navi Yeshayahu, "Vayu einecha ro'ot et morecha," that your eyes should always see your rabbis. You should look up to them. You should have pictures of them if you can. You should see them. Go and speak to them, because those who you see, those who you admire, this is what these will be hopefully who your children will admire. It's always good to tell stories of tzaddikim. The best Sefer Musar, if you have a choice of what Sefer Musar to read, what book of ethics to read the life story of a tzaddik, of a righteous man. You will be impressed at how he lived his life. So much so that you hopefully will want to emulate his life. So reading stories about tzaddikim is very, very good, very healthy. Whenever I see a child reading a book and they tell me it's a novel, I say, Chaval, a novel? What's a novel? A novel is an untrue story. It's a figment of the imagination of the author. It's a complete fabrication. There is so much true information. Why are you reading something that was made up? And I asked this once to an adult, a goy, and he says all it is an escape. If you want an escape, go to the beach. Go get some fresh air. What do you need to read a novel? A novel doesn't make any. Now there are some good novels that are based on real stories. That may be so, but there's so much true information, there's so many good stories, of real stories that happened, that you can learn something from them. Why waste your time? Remember, life is short. Unless you can speed read, it takes a while to finish a book. How many books could you read? Anytime I get a gift, somebody buys me a book, I tell them, I hope you don't mind, but it's going to be about 12 years from now by the time I get to it. Why is that? Because there's a big long line of books waiting to be read. I can't get to all of them. How much time do we have? So at least be picky what you read, right? In the Sefer Tanat Elyahu, it says that one should always ask himself, "Matai yagiu ma'asai le'masei avotai Avraham, Yitzchak v'Yaakov." A Jew should always aspire and ask himself, when will I be like my forefathers? When will I be like my grandparents? Because previous generations were really special. They were willing to sacrifice everything for a good education, to remain Jewish. One always has to look back and aspire to be like his parents, his grandparents. Children, hopefully, should aspire to be like their grandparents, their great-grandparents, the tzaddikim. But instead, what happens? Anybody knows what most children aspire to be these days? This is what I do. I go over, I approach, it could be a 10-year-old or even a 15-year-old, and I ask them this question: what do you want to be when you grow up? And most of them will tell me a lawyer, a doctor, a teacher, probably I haven't heard. Let me see. A pilot. You hear all these things. An astronaut, yeah. And as soon as I hear their response, I tell them, I didn't ask you what you want to make a livelihood from. What your parnasah is going to be. I asked you what you want to be. And what you really should tell me is what you want to make of yourself. And the answer should be a good Jew, Yirei Shamayim. There was once an individual who came to town, a rabbi, who asked me a similar question: what do you do? It's a famous question when you meet somebody, what do you do? He says, I try to serve Hashem. What he really meant to ask me is, what do I do for a living? So when he said, no, I meant, what do you do for a living? So I said, well, say so. What do you do for a living? Hopefully, what we're doing, what we're trying to do, what we want to aspire to be, is God-fearing Jews. That should be priority number one. What we do for a living, that's secondary. It's not a goal, it's just a means. Another important area is that we emphasize certain hergelim, certain habits that kids should get used to. For example, when somebody comes for tzedakah, if I have the opportunity, I tell my child to bring the checkbook. I write the check and I ask my child to give it to the individual. Get him used to certain hergelim, to certain activities. As the rabbis tell us in the Gemara, Gedolah shimusha shel Torah yoter milimuda. The shimush of the Torah, not only preaching but practicing what you preach, is much more important. Giving over Torah, teaching the child is important, but shimusha shel Torah, actually putting it to work, practicing, is much more important. So another area of importance that we need to emphasize is to get them used to, when they're young, to certain activities. We want them to visit the sick. If that's important to us, take them with us. Right? We want them to learn to give tzedakah, make them give tzedakah. And this applies to girls as well. And in schools, in many of the schools today, they get them used to doing these things early on, because we want them to get used to certain habits, because habits become second nature. Another important area that this is especially applicable to teenagers is for us to continuously know where the kids are. Where were you late at night? What places are they going to? Who are they befriending? These days, because of access to the internet, it's very dangerous. I don't think I have to explain and elaborate on that. You've heard the many, many stories of kids that got caught up in this internet. So we want to continuously be aware of what they're doing and where they're going. We have a few moments left, and I want to just spend the next few minutes on what do we do if things are really getting out of hand and we feel we've lost control. We think we've done everything right, but the child is a difficult child. In the Torah it says, "Vayigdelu hane'arim." Esav and Yaakov grew up. Even though they grew up in the same home, Vayi Esav ish yodea tzayid, ish sadeh, v'Yaakov ish tam yoshev ohalim. Esav became a hunter. Yaakov became a Torah scholar. And I once asked why. And the answer is in the pasuk. Vayi Esav ish yodea tzayid. You know why Esav became a hunter? Because he was an ish sadeh. He spent all his time in the field. Yaakov ish tam. Why? Because yoshev ohalim. He was in the ohel, in the tent of Torah. It depends where the child spends time. If a child learns with his father, if a child is at the Bet HaKnesset, he goes to classes, right? Hopefully, this will remain with him. This is what he will want. If he minimizes this, if you don't emphasize this enough, if you don't care about these things, then the chances are that he will be in the sadeh, he will be in the street, he will be in the field. It's very important where the child spends his time. I'm talking about right now his free time, because they're in school. What are his hobbies? What does he do with his free time? But the most important of all, you're going to be surprised, is prayer. Because prayer, litpalel, the rabbis tell us that many have attempted the many suggestions that the Gemara brings for how to become rich, how to have kids, good kids. And the Gemara says, after all the suggestions have been given, the Gemara says, many tried these out. Right? Velo itzlichu. Harbe asu velo itzlichu. Many were tried these and were unsuccessful. So what should they do? Pray to the one who gives the children. That's their only recourse. We have to be mitpalel that Kadosh Baruch Hu should be an active partner with us, not silent partner. And there are many stories of parents who prayed and who were zocheh, who had the merit of seeing beautiful kids because of their prayer alone. Rabbi Yeshua, in Pirkei Avot, the rabbis tell us, Ashrei Yolato. Fortunate is his mother. Why is his mother so fortunate? What about all the other rabbis? So the rabbis tell us because this mother not only prayed, she used to take this baby, Rabbi Yeshua, when he was a little baby, into all the Batei Midrashot, into all the yeshivot, into all the Batei Knesset, that this child should absorb Torah from when he was a baby. So the rabbis should bless him. So because she put so much of an emphasis on getting blessings and praying to Hashem, she zachta to have such a child. I want to end with what the Rambam tells us. כל שאינו מקפיד, in the end of הלכות סוטה, כל שאינו מקפיד על אשתו ובניו ובני ביתו ומזהירם ופוקד עליהם תמיד עד שידע שהן שלמים מכל חטא ועוון, הרי זה חוטא, שנאמר, וידעת כי שלום אהליך ופקדת נביאך ולא תחטא. One who is not strict, who does not supervise his children, and does not tell them if something is wrong, that they're doing something wrong, and he's not mashgiach, in other words, he does not oversee what they're doing, he does not make sure that they're clean, and that they're doing the right things, and that they stay away from avon, then he's committing a sin. A father's responsibility is to always be on the lookout. And as we said last week, one of the greatest dangers in chinuch, in education of one's children, is hesech da'at, when one is oblivious, when one does not pay attention to what his children are doing. If one wants to have good children, then one has to make an effort in being a good example, in being on top of them, in not being oblivious, and let's not forget in praying. We all need to pray, because even though, as I said last week, we've tried our best, and we ourselves are good, there's no guarantee that even if the parents were the best parents, that their children will be just as good as them. Because every man has free will. But what they pick up as children, there's no doubt, will make a big difference in their lives. I don't think we have too much time left, but I'm just going to quickly tell you a story just to impress upon you how children absorb everything from when they're very young. Right after the Holocaust, there were many children in monasteries, Jewish children, who were lost, who were dropped off by their parents, who were led to Auschwitz. Rabbi Kahneman went out to search these children. And he told the priest, I know you have 200 children in this monastery. Please give me the 200 children so I can start from scratch. And the priest tells him, how do you know who's a Jew? They all have a cross. They all forgot probably anything about Judaism. They came here when they were 3-4 years old. Circumcision? There are many non-Jews who were circumcised too. You want to spend here weeks till you figure it out? The rabbi says, I only need 60 seconds. Give me 60 seconds and I will pull out 200 Jewish children. 60 seconds, Rabbi? You have the floor. The rabbi went into a lunchroom where there were hundreds of kids, boys and girls. They all looked the same. And he turned to them and he started saying, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And as soon as he said those words, 200 kids stood up and ran towards him and called out, Mame, Mame, take us home. The children cried, the rabbi cried, and some say even the priest cried. He couldn't believe it. And he turns to the rabbi, the priest, he says, you won, but tell me, how did you do it? And he says, I knew I couldn't remind them anything about Judaism because they left when they were 3-4 years old. They were either dropped off by their parents or by the Polish neighbors who took the kids. And they don't remember anything. So I tried to remind them their mother. And what better way to remind one about his mother than by reminding them about the Shema Yisrael that all the mothers, all the Jewish mothers would say with their little kids before they would go to sleep. They would kiss the mezuzah, they would say the Shema Yisrael. In those few moments that the mother spent with her children, even when they were 2-3 years old, was permanently etched in the memories of those children. You see, priest, you see, all I had to say was Shema Yisrael, and you saw how many of them came running to me. So I think this proves that children absorb a great deal, and whatever we can instill in them when they're very young, B'ezrat Hashem will remain with them forever. And this is B'ezrat Hashem what will bring us the true nachat.